I'm Sarah Mitchell, and 3 weeks ago, I stood in the back of my own funeral, listening to my stepmother read what she believed was my last will and testament. The room was packed with relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, all wearing black, and nodding solemnly as Margaret's voice echoed through the chapel. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special. For you, when she reached the part about leaving my entire inheritance to my half-sister instead of the animal shelter I'd actually chosen, I couldn't contain myself any longer. I stepped into the room and said, "Well, this is awkward." Growing up in the small town of Millbrook, Connecticut, I learned early that family isn't always what it seems. My mother, Katherine Mitchell, died when I was 8 years old in a car accident that turned my world upside down. She was driving home from her job at the local elementary school where she taught 3rd grade, the same school I attended. I remember the principal, Mrs. Davidson, coming to get me from my classroom that rainy October afternoon. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking as she led me to the office where my father waited with red-rimmed eyes. My father, Robert Mitchell, was a successful real estate developer who owned half the commercial properties in our county. He was a big man with calloused hands and a booming laugh that could fill any room. After my mother's death, that laugh became rare, replaced by long silences and the smell of whiskey that seemed to follow him everywhere. For 2 years, it was just the two of us in our large colonial house on Maple Street. He tried his best to be both parents, helping with homework at the kitchen table and braiding my hair for school pictures, though the results were always lopsided and loose by lunchtime. Those were some of my happiest memories, despite the sadness that hung over everything. My father would make pancakes shaped like animals on Sunday mornings, and we'd spend Saturday afternoons at his construction sites where I'd wear a tiny hard hat and pretend to inspect his work. He called me his little engineer and promised that someday I'd help him design buildings that would last forever. I felt special, chosen, like I was the most important person in his world. Everything changed when I turned 10 and my father met Margaret Hayes at a charity auction for the local hospital. Margaret was a widow herself, with a 6-year-old daughter named Chloe from her previous marriage. She was petite and blonde with perfect makeup and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative and drove a pristine white BMW that she washed every weekend without fail. Where my mother had been warm and laughing, with flour often dusting her apron and paint under her fingernails from her weekend art projects, Margaret was polished and controlled. The courtship was swift. Within 6 months, Margaret and Chloe had moved into our house, bringing with them an entirely new energy that felt foreign and uncomfortable. Margaret immediately began rearranging furniture, replacing my mother's cozy quilts with sleek modern throws, and boxing up family photos to make room for her own decorative choices. The kitchen, once filled with the aroma of my mother's homemade bread and cookies, now smelled of Margaret's expensive candles and takeout containers from upscale restaurants. Chloe was a quiet child with enormous blue eyes and an uncanny ability to appear innocent in any situation. She had a way of watching and listening that made me uncomfortable, as if she was always gathering information for some future use. When adults were around, she was sweet and helpful. But when we were alone, she would take my toys without asking and tell elaborate lies about things I had supposedly done or said. If I complained, Margaret would defend her with fierce protectiveness, explaining that Chloe was still adjusting to having a new family and needed patience and understanding. My father, desperate to create a happy blended family, seemed determined to believe that any problems were simply growing pains that would resolve themselves with time. He started working longer hours, leaving early in the morning and returning home well after dinner. When he was present, he was distracted, often checking his phone or reviewing contracts while Margaret chatted about her day, or Chloe practiced piano in the living room. The man who had once given me his undivided attention during our pancake Breakfasts now seemed to see me only peripherally. As one part of a larger family unit he was trying to manage successfully, the shift in dynamics became apparent almost immediately. Margaret had opinions about everything from my clothing choices to my after-school activities. She thought my jeans were too torn and my t-shirts too boyish, preferring that I dress more like Chloe in floral dresses and patent leather shoes. When I protested that I was more comfortable in casual clothes, she would sigh and tell my father that I was going through a difficult phase and needed guidance from a mother figure. My bedroom, which had been my sanctuary, decorated with posters of rockets and planets and shelves full of science books, gradually became subject to Margaret's influence as well. She suggested that at my age, I might want to redecorate with something more mature and feminine. When I resisted, she enlisted my father's support, convincing him that helping me transition from little girl interests to young lady pursuits was part of healthy development. Slowly, my space rockets were replaced with floral curtains and my microscope set disappeared to make room for a vanity table I never used. School became my refuge. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that impressed my teachers and worried some of my friends' parents who thought I was too serious for a 10-year-old. Mathematics and science were my favorite subjects, probably because they offered clear answers and logical processes that made sense in a way my home life increasingly didn't. I joined the science club and spent every possible afternoon working on experiments or building models for the regional science fair. My teacher, Mrs. Patterson, noticed my dedication and began giving me extra challenges and advanced materials to work with. She had known my mother professionally and would sometimes stay after school to help me with particularly complex projects. During these sessions, she would ask gentle questions about how I was adjusting to my new family situation. I learned to give cheerful, appropriate answers about how nice it was to have a sister and how grateful I was that my father was happy again. The truth was more complicated. While I genuinely wanted my father to be happy, I felt increasingly invisible. In my own home, family dinners became formal affairs where Margaret dominated the conversation with stories from her work or updates about Chloe's various activities and achievements. My father would nod and ask appropriate questions, but his attention seemed performative, as if he was playing the role of interested stepfather and husband rather than genuinely engaging. When I tried to share news about school or my science projects, the conversation would quickly shift to other topics. Margaret had a particular talent for redirecting attention to Chloe, often interrupting my stories to point out something adorable or clever that her daughter had done that day. Chloe, for her part, seemed to understand her privileged position and would often elaborate on her mother's stories with additional details that cast her in an even more favorable light. My father's response to these dynamics was to retreat further into his work. He began traveling more frequently for business, leaving Margaret in charge of household decisions and daily routines. When he was home, he seemed relieved to defer to her judgment about child-rearing matters, often saying that she had more recent experience with young children and better understood what we needed. The financial aspects of our blended family were something I became aware of gradually. Margaret had moved into our house, which my father owned outright, and had quit her pharmaceutical sales job shortly after their marriage to focus on being a full-time mother and household manager. This arrangement meant that my father was supporting all four of us on his real estate income, which was substantial but not unlimited. Margaret seemed to have expensive tastes, regularly redecorating rooms and purchasing new furniture, artwork, and clothing for herself and Chloe. My own needs became increasingly modest in comparison. When I outgrew my clothes, Margaret would suggest shopping at discount stores or looking through Chloe's hand-me-downs, even though Chloe was 4 years younger and significantly smaller than me. When my friends received new bicycles or electronic devices for birthdays, I learned not to express similar desires because they were deemed unnecessary expenses. The most painful part of this period was watching my relationship with my father deteriorate slowly. The man who had once called me his little engineer and promised to teach me everything about building and design now seemed to see me as one responsibility among many. Our Saturday construction site visits stopped entirely, replaced by family outings to places that Margaret and Chloe preferred, like shopping malls and craft fairs. When I turned 12, I asked my father if I could take a programming class that was being offered at the local community center. Computer programming seemed like a natural extension of my interest in logical problem solving, and several of my friends were enrolled. The class cost $60 for the semester, a modest amount that wouldn't have been an issue in our household before Margaret and Chloe joined us. My father hesitated when I asked, glancing at Margaret for her opinion. She pointed out that Chloe was interested in dance classes that cost significantly more, and perhaps it would be better to wait until the following semester to see if I was still interested in programming. The dance classes were approved immediately, while my programming class was forgotten entirely. This incident crystallized something for me about how decisions were made in our household and where my priorities ranked. Around this time, I began to understand that my father's business was more complex than I had realized as a young child. Mitchell Development wasn't just about building individual houses or small commercial properties. My father had partnerships with several investors and managed multiple ongoing projects simultaneously. He employed a small staff of contractors, architects, and administrative workers, and the success of his business depended on his ability to secure financing for new developments and maintain relationships with local banks and city planning officials. Margaret took an active interest in his work in ways that my mother never had. She attended business dinners and charity events as his partner, networking with other spouses and helping to cultivate the social connections that were important for his continued success. She had opinions about which projects he should prioritize, and which partnerships offered the best opportunities for growth. My father seemed to value her input and would often discuss major business decisions with her while I sat nearby doing homework, absorbing information about profit margins and zoning regulations and construction timelines. What I didn't understand at the time was that Margaret was also learning about the financial details of my father's business and personal assets. She asked thoughtful questions about his retirement planning and investment strategies. She expressed concern about proper estate planning and the importance of having updated legal documents that reflected his current family situation. These conversations seemed responsible and caring, the kind of discussions that a good wife would have with her husband about their shared future. The summer I turned 13, my father decided it was time to update his will and other legal documents. He explained that when my mother died, he had created a simple will that left everything to me. But now that he had a new family, the documents needed to reflect his current responsibilities and wishes. This seemed logical and appropriate. Margaret and Chloe were part of our family now, and it made sense that they would be included in his estate planning. The process of updating his legal documents took several months and involved meetings with lawyers and financial planners. Margaret was actively involved in all of these discussions, often taking notes and asking detailed questions about various scenarios and contingencies. She wanted to understand exactly how assets would be distributed and what provisions would be made for Chloe's education and future needs. During one of these conversations, which took place in our kitchen after Chloe and I had supposedly gone to bed, I overheard Margaret expressing concern about my future as well. She pointed out that I was a bright child who would certainly want to attend college, and she thought it was important that adequate provisions were made for my education. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She also mentioned that my mother's family had some valuable jewelry and family heirlooms that should probably be specifically designated for me in the will to ensure there were no questions about inheritance later. Her thoughtfulness about my interests seemed genuine and caring, and I felt a surge of gratitude toward her for looking out for my future. Maybe I had been too quick to judge her intentions, I thought. Maybe she really was trying to create a fair and loving blended family where everyone's needs were considered equally. The new will was finalized just before my 14th birthday. My father explained the basic structure to me in simple terms. saying that the document ensured that everyone in our family would be taken care of if anything happened to him. Margaret would inherit the house and enough money to maintain her lifestyle and continue caring for Chloe. There were education funds established for both Chloe and me, and my mother's jewelry and personal belongings were specifically designated as mine. What he didn't explain, and what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that the majority of his business assets and investments were structured to benefit Margaret and Chloe primarily, with smaller provisions for my education and personal items. The logic, as Margaret had presented it to him, was that as his wife and step-parent to his child, she would naturally continue to provide for my needs using the resources he left her. This arrangement seemed more practical than trying to divide everything equally between a minor child and an adult who would have ongoing household and childcare responsibilities. High school brought new challenges and opportunities. I excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and science courses, and began to develop clearer ideas about what I wanted to study in college. My guidance counselor, Mr. Roberts, encouraged me to consider engineering programs at prestigious universities and helped me research scholarship opportunities and application requirements. These conversations about my future always felt somewhat abstract because they required financial planning and family support that I wasn't sure I could count on. Margaret continued to express general encouragement about my education, but specific discussions about college costs and application fees were often postponed or redirected. When friends' families visited colleges during junior year spring break trips, our family went to Disney World instead, a vacation that Chloe had been requesting for months. My father's business continued to grow during my high school years, but so did his stress levels and the complexity of his projects. He was developing a large mixed-use complex that required navigating complicated zoning issues and environmental regulations. The project was potentially very profitable, but required significant upfront investment and carried substantial financial risk if permits were delayed or construction costs exceeded projections. Margaret was more involved than ever in these business discussions, and I began to notice that she had opinions not just about social aspects of his work, but about strategic and financial decisions as well. She encouraged him to take on larger projects with higher profit potential, even when he expressed concerns about overextending himself financially. She seemed confident that his expertise and reputation would see him through any temporary difficulties. During my senior year, as I was applying to colleges and waiting for acceptance letters, my father suffered what his doctor called a minor heart attack. He was 52 years old and had been working increasingly long hours while managing stress about the complex development project and some unexpected cost overruns that were affecting his cash flow. The heart attack happened on a Tuesday morning while he was reviewing contracts in his home office. Margaret found him slumped over his desk and called an ambulance immediately. He spent 3 days in the hospital while doctors ran tests and adjusted his medications. The cardiologist explained that the heart attack was a warning sign that needed to be taken seriously. My father would need to reduce stress, exercise regularly, eat better, and consider scaling back his work responsibilities to protect his long-term health. The experience was terrifying for all of us, but it also seemed to bring our family closer together temporarily. Margaret was genuinely worried and attentive, managing his care and following up with doctor's appointments and medication schedules. Chloe and I both spent more time at home, helping with household tasks and keeping him company during his recovery period. For a few weeks, it felt like we might actually be the loving blended family that my father had always hoped we could become. We had family dinners where everyone participated in conversation, and my father seemed more present and engaged than he had been in years. He asked detailed questions about my college applications and expressed pride in my academic achievements. He even suggested that once he was fully recovered, we might take a trip together to visit some of the engineering programs I was considering. Unfortunately, this period of family harmony was brief. As my father's immediate health scare faded, and he began to feel stronger, the underlying dynamics of our household reasserted themselves. Margaret resumed her focus on redecorating projects and Chloe's activities, and my father gradually returned to his demanding work schedule despite his doctor's recommendations. The major development project that had been causing him stress was nearing completion, but final inspections revealed some issues that required expensive corrections. These unexpected costs, combined with delays that had extended the construction timeline, meant that the project would be significantly less profitable than originally projected. My father was frustrated and worried about the financial implications for his business. During this same period, I received acceptance letters from several excellent engineering programs, including some schools that offered partial scholarships based on my academic performance. The remaining costs for tuition, room, and board were substantial but manageable for a family with my father's income level. I was excited about my options and eager to visit campuses and make a final decision about where to enroll. When I brought up the topic of college visits and enrollment deposits, however, my father seemed distracted and stressed. He mentioned that the business was going through a challenging period and asked if I could wait a few weeks before making any major financial commitments. Margaret suggested that I consider starting at the local community college for my first 2 years to save money, then transferring to a 4-year program later. This suggestion surprised and disappointed me, since I had been working toward admission to competitive engineering programs throughout high school. Community college was a perfectly respectable choice, but it didn't offer the advanced coursework and research opportunities that I was hoping to access. More importantly, my father had always encouraged my academic ambitions and had never suggested that cost would be a limiting factor in my education. When I pressed for more specific information about our financial situation and what I could realistically expect for college support, my father became uncomfortable and suggested that we discuss it later when things settled down with his business. Margaret stepped in to explain that they were simply trying to be financially responsible and ensure that all of their decisions were well considered given the current uncertainty. Over the following weeks, it became clear that my college plans were being indefinitely postponed while my father dealt with business issues. Meanwhile, Chloe, who was now a high school sophomore, was enrolled in expensive SAT prep courses and had begun taking college campus tours with Margaret to start planning her future educational path. The contrast in how our academic futures were being prioritized was stark and painful. I began to feel like I was witnessing my own opportunities slipping away while I waited for a family discussion about finances that never seemed to happen. My guidance counselor warned me that enrollment deposits were due soon and that I risked losing my place in competitive programs if I delayed much longer. Some of the scholarships I had been offered were time-sensitive and would expire if not accepted by specific deadlines. Taking matters into my own hands, I researched student loan options and work-study programs that might allow me to finance my education independently. I discovered that as a dependent student, I would need my father's financial information for loan applications, and the amount I could borrow was limited. Without family support, attending an expensive private university would require accumulating debt that seemed overwhelming and potentially unmanageable. The stress of this situation, combined with watching my father's continued health issues and business struggles, created a level of tension in our household that felt different from the usual undercurrents of resentment and favoritism. Everyone seemed on edge, and conversations about practical matters like college planning or family finances became charged with emotion and frustration. One evening in late April, as deadlines for college decisions approached rapidly, I decided to have a direct conversation with my father about my situation. I found him in his study after dinner, reviewing spreadsheets related to his troubled development project. I knocked on the doorframe and asked if we could talk about my college plans. He looked up from his computer with the tired expression that had become habitual over the past several months. "Sarah, I know this is important, and I promise we'll figure something out. The business situation is just more complicated than I expected, and I need to see how some things shake out before I can make commitments about tuition payments." I sat down in the chair across from his desk, the same chair where I had sat for countless conversations throughout my childhood and adolescence. "Dad, I understand that money is tight right now, but some of these deadlines can't wait. If I don't accept the scholarship offer from state by Friday, I'll lose it completely. And I need to put down enrollment deposits this week if I want to secure my place anywhere." He rubbed his temples, a gesture that had become frequent since his heart attack. "How much are we talking about for the deposits?" I had prepared for this question and pulled out a folder with information about my top 3 school choices. State requires a $500 deposit to hold my scholarship. The private schools are asking for between $800 and $1,200 to secure enrollment. My father was quiet for several moments, looking at the papers I had given him. Finally, he said, "Margaret and I have been talking about this, and we think the smartest approach might be for you to take a gap year. Work for 12 months, save some money, and let the business situation stabilize. Then you can apply again next year with a clearer picture of what we can afford." The suggestion felt like a physical blow. A gap year would mean losing all of the scholarships and acceptances I had worked so hard to earn. Starting the application process over again the following year would put me at a disadvantage, and there was no guarantee that I would receive the same opportunities or financial aid offers. "Dad, that doesn't make sense academically or financially," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and rational. "The scholarships I have now are based on my current grades and test scores. If I wait a year, I'll be competing against a new pool of applicants, and I might not get the same offers. Plus, a gap year would only help if I could save a significant amount of money. But entry-level jobs for high school graduates don't pay enough to make a real dent in college costs." He nodded as if he understood my points, but I could see that his mind was elsewhere, probably calculating construction costs and loan payments and cash flow projections. "I hear what you're saying, Sarah, but I can't make financial commitments right now that I might not be able to follow through on. If I promise to pay for an expensive school and then can't deliver, we'll all be in a worse situation." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but it became clear that my father's position was firm. He was not willing to commit to supporting my immediate enrollment in college, regardless of which option I chose or how much financial aid I had been offered. The uncertainty about his business had made him extremely cautious about any additional financial obligations. As I left his study that night, I felt a profound sense of loss that went beyond disappointment about college plans. The father who had once called me his little engineer and promised to teach me about building things that would last forever had just told me that my education was not a priority he could commit to supporting. The dreams and plans that had motivated me throughout high school suddenly seemed naive and unrealistic. Over the next few days, I watched the deadlines for my college acceptances pass one by one. I called the admissions offices to explain that I would not be enrolling, and I felt a piece of my future slipping away with each conversation. The guidance counselor at school was sympathetic, but couldn't offer any solutions that would change the fundamental problem of needing family financial support that was not available. Margaret was supportive in general terms, expressing confidence that everything would work out for the best and that a gap year might actually be a valuable experience for me. She pointed out that many successful people had taken non-traditional paths to their careers, and that starting college a year later wouldn't ultimately matter. Her encouragement felt hollow, though, especially when contrasted with the detailed planning and financial preparation that continued for Chloe's future education. The summer after high school graduation was unlike anything I had expected. Instead of preparing for college and looking forward to new academic challenges, I was working at a local restaurant and living at home while trying to figure out what my next steps should be. The gap year that my father had suggested as a temporary solution began to feel more permanent as months passed without any clear timeline for when our family's financial situation might improve. My father's business eventually stabilized, but not in the way he had hoped. The problematic development project was completed and sold, but the profit margins were much smaller than projected. He scaled back his operations significantly, focusing on smaller, less risky projects that generated steady but modest income. The stress of the previous year had taken a toll on his health and his appetite for aggressive expansion. Margaret seemed to adapt well to the family's reduced circumstances, finding ways to maintain their lifestyle through careful budgeting and strategic spending choices. She became more involved in my father's business operations, helping with administrative tasks and client communications. Her contributions were valuable and appreciated, and their partnership in both business and personal matters grew stronger during this period. For me, however, the gap year extended into a second year, and then a third. Community college became my default option, not because it was the best fit for my goals, but because it was what I could afford while living at home and working part-time. I studied engineering prerequisites and maintained excellent grades, but the advanced research opportunities and intensive programs I had originally hoped for were no longer accessible. The dynamic in our family solidified around this new reality. Margaret and my father operated as a team, making decisions about household matters and business issues together. Chloe continued to be the focus of educational planning and investment, with her parents carefully researching high-quality schools and programs that would position her for success. I became the responsible older sister who was making practical choices and learning valuable life lessons about independence and financial reality. By the time I was 21, I had completed my associate degree and was working full-time as a junior technician at a local engineering firm. The work was interesting, and I was learning practical skills, but it wasn't the career path I had originally envisioned. My supervisors encouraged me to continue my education and eventually pursue professional engineering certification, but the time and money required for a bachelor's degree still seemed out of reach. It was around this time that I began to seriously think about my long-term financial independence and what I would need to do to create the opportunities for myself that my family was unable or unwilling to provide. I started researching student loans for independent students and looking into online and part-time degree programs that might allow me to continue working while completing my education. The process of exploring these options made me realize how much I had accepted limitations that weren't necessarily permanent or inevitable. With careful planning and some financial sacrifice, I could potentially create a path toward the engineering career I had always wanted. It would take longer and require more effort than the traditional route I had originally planned, but it was still possible. This realization marked the beginning of a shift in how I thought about my relationship with my family and my own agency in shaping my future. Instead of waiting for circumstances to improve or for my father to be in a position to support my goals, I began taking concrete steps toward independence and self-sufficiency. The first step was moving out of my father's house and into a small apartment that I could afford on my technician's salary. This decision surprised my family, who had assumed I would continue living at home while saving money and helping with household responsibilities. Margaret expressed concern that I was rushing into independence before I was fully prepared for the costs and challenges of living alone. My father was more supportive of the decision, understanding that at 21, I was ready for my own space and autonomy. He helped me move my belongings and expressed pride in my responsible approach to budgeting and planning. He also seemed relieved, I thought, to have one fewer person to worry about supporting during a period when his business required careful financial management. Moving into my own apartment was both exciting and intimidating. For the first time in my life, I had complete control over my environment and decisions. I could decorate however I wanted, cook meals that I enjoyed, and structure my time according to my own priorities and preferences. The independence was intoxicating, but it also made me acutely aware of how much I had been shaped by years of adapting to other people's expectations and preferences. Living alone also gave me perspective on the family dynamics I had grown up with. Without the daily interactions and tensions of shared household space, I could think more clearly about the patterns of favoritism and control that had influenced my adolescent years. I began to understand that some of the limitations I had accepted weren't necessarily about financial constraints or practical considerations, but about priorities and values that favored some family members over others. Working as an engineering technician while living independently taught me lessons that no classroom could have provided. My daily responsibilities involved testing materials, reviewing blueprints, and assisting senior engineers with project calculations. The work was methodical and precise, requiring attention to detail that reminded me why I had fallen in love with engineering in the first place. Every successful test result and accurate measurement felt like a small victory, proof that I belonged in this field, despite taking an unconventional path to get there. My supervisor, David Chen, was a licensed professional engineer who had built his career through a combination of formal education and practical experience. He noticed my dedication and began assigning me increasingly complex tasks that stretched my abilities and taught me skills beyond my job description. During slow periods, he would explain advanced concepts and show me how theoretical principles applied to real-world construction projects. David became an unexpected mentor, encouraging me to pursue additional certifications and eventually complete my bachelor's degree. He had worked with several technicians over the years who had successfully transitioned to full engineering roles, and he believed I had the aptitude and work ethic to follow a similar path. His confidence in my abilities was refreshing after years of feeling like my ambitions were impractical or unrealistic. Through David's guidance, I enrolled in evening classes at the state university, taking 1 or 2 courses per semester while continuing to work full-time. The pace was slow but sustainable, and I found that my practical work experience actually enhanced my understanding of theoretical concepts. Problems that might have seemed abstract in a traditional classroom setting made perfect sense when I could relate them to projects I had worked on at the engineering firm. Balancing work, school, and independent living required careful time management and financial planning. My apartment was modest but comfortable, and I took pride in furnishing it gradually with pieces I could afford. I learned to cook simple meals, manage a household budget, and handle the various responsibilities of adult life that I had never fully appreciated while living with my family. The distance from my father's house also gave me emotional space to process the disappointment and resentment I had been carrying about my derailed college plans. I began to understand that while my family's financial situation had certainly influenced my options, I had also allowed myself to become passive in pursuing my goals. The gap year that had extended into several years had been partly due to circumstances beyond my control, but also partly due to my own reluctance to take risks or challenge the limitations that others had imposed on my choices. This realization was both painful and empowering. I couldn't change the opportunities I had missed, but I could take responsibility for creating new ones. The evening classes were just the beginning of a longer-term plan to complete my degree and eventually qualify for professional engineering licensure. It would take several more years, but I was finally moving toward the career I had always wanted. My relationship with my family during this period was cordial but somewhat distant. I visited for holidays and special occasions, but the regular interactions that had defined our daily life when I lived at home were replaced by more formal, scheduled contacts. Margaret and my father seemed pleased that I was doing well independently, and they expressed general support for my educational pursuits without offering specific assistance or involvement. Chloe, now in her senior year of high school, was focused on college applications and had been accepted to several prestigious universities with substantial financial support from my father. Her academic record was impressive, and she had been involved in numerous extracurricular activities that demonstrated leadership and community involvement. Watching her college preparation process reminded me of my own high school experience, but without the disappointing conclusion. During one family dinner, Margaret mentioned that they were planning a graduation trip to Europe for Chloe as a reward for her academic achievements and as a celebration before she started college. The trip would include visits to historical sites and cultural attractions that would complement her planned major in art history. The cost of such a trip was significant, certainly more than the college deposits that had been deemed unaffordable for my education several years earlier. I felt a familiar sting of resentment at the casual way expensive opportunities were provided for Chloe, while my own educational journey required scraping together tuition payments and studying late into the night after full work days. However, I also recognized that dwelling on these comparisons was counterproductive and emotionally draining. Chloe hadn't chosen the family dynamics that favored her, and my energy was better spent focusing on my own progress rather than cataloging unfairness. The summer before Chloe left for college, my father experienced another health scare. This time, it was a more serious heart episode that required emergency surgery and several days in intensive care. The family rallied around him during the crisis, and I took time off work to be at the hospital and help coordinate his care. The experience reminded me how much I still loved my father, despite our complicated relationship and financial disagreements. During his recovery, he seemed more reflective about his priorities and relationships. He made an effort to spend individual time with both Chloe and me, asking about our goals and expressing regret that his business troubles had affected family decisions in recent years. When he and I talked privately, he acknowledged that he wished he had been able to support my college plans more effectively, and he expressed pride in how well I had managed to create opportunities for myself. These conversations felt like a step toward healing some of the distance that had developed between us. While I couldn't forget the disappointment of having my educational dreams deferred, I appreciated his recognition of my efforts and his acknowledgement that the situation hadn't been handled ideally. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was progress toward a more honest and mutual understanding. My father's health problems also prompted him to revisit his estate planning and legal documents. He mentioned that he wanted to ensure his will and other paperwork reflected his current wishes, and took into account how our family circumstances had evolved over the past several years. Margaret was heavily involved in these discussions, as she had been during the previous update to his legal documents. The process of reviewing and updating estate planning seemed to cause my father significant stress. He would spend hours in his study with legal documents and financial statements, often appearing frustrated or overwhelmed by the complexity of organizing his assets and determining fair distributions. Margaret was supportive during this time, helping him gather necessary paperwork and accompanying him to meetings with attorneys and financial advisors. One evening, when I stopped by to check on his recovery, I found him in his study surrounded by legal documents and looking particularly troubled. When I asked if everything was all right, he explained that estate planning was more complicated than he had anticipated, especially when trying to balance the needs of a current spouse and children from different relationships. He wanted to ensure that Margaret would be financially secure if something happened to him, since she had given up her career to focus on managing their household and supporting his business. At the same time, he wanted to make sure that both Chloe and I would have resources for our education and future needs. The challenge was structuring arrangements that were fair to everyone while also being practical and legally sound. I assured him that I didn't expect or need elaborate financial provisions from his estate. My engineering career was progressing well, and I was confident in my ability to support myself and achieve my goals independently. What mattered most to me was knowing that he was proud of what I had accomplished and that our relationship was on solid ground. My father seemed relieved by this conversation, and over the following weeks, he appeared less stressed about the estate planning process. I assumed that our discussion had helped him feel more confident about making decisions that balanced everyone's interests appropriately. As Chloe prepared to leave for college, the household dynamic shifted once again. Margaret threw herself into helping with dorm room preparation and coordinating all the details of Chloe's transition to university life. My father, still recovering from his surgery, was less involved in the daily logistics, but provided financial support for everything Chloe needed to start her college experience successfully. The contrast between Chloe's college preparation and my own experience several years earlier was stark, but I tried to focus on feeling happy for her rather than bitter about the differences. She was a bright young woman who deserved opportunities to pursue her interests and develop her talents. The fact that her path was smoother than mine had been didn't diminish her achievements or make her unworthy of support. During Chloe's first semester at college, I reached a significant milestone in my own educational journey. I completed enough credits to apply for transfer to the engineering program at the state university as a junior. My grades were excellent, and my practical work experience made me a strong candidate for admission. David wrote a recommendation letter emphasizing my technical abilities and professional potential. The acceptance letter arrived in November, along with information about financial aid and course scheduling for the spring semester. After years of part-time evening classes, I would finally be able to pursue engineering full-time and complete my degree within 2 years. The tuition costs were manageable with a combination of student loans and continued part-time work, and David had agreed to adjust my schedule to accommodate my class requirements. I called my father to share the news, and his excitement and pride were genuine and enthusiastic. He congratulated me on my persistence and told me how impressed he was with everything I had accomplished while working and living independently. Margaret also expressed pleasure at my success and said she had always known I would find a way to achieve my educational goals. The conversation felt like a validation of the path I had chosen and the years of effort I had invested in reaching this point. While my route to an engineering degree had been longer and more challenging than I had originally planned, the experience had taught me valuable lessons about persistence, resourcefulness, and self-reliance that would serve me well throughout my career. Starting full-time university classes after years of working felt like stepping into a different world. The campus energy, academic discussions, and research opportunities were invigorating after the practical focus of my technician work. I was older than most of my classmates and had more real-world experience, which gave me a different perspective on theoretical concepts and course material. My professors appreciated the practical knowledge I brought to classroom discussions, and several encouraged me to consider graduate school after completing my bachelor's degree. The idea of pursuing advanced education seemed both exciting and daunting, especially given the financial considerations and time commitment involved. During my first semester back in school full-time, my father's business began to recover from the difficulties of previous years. He had developed a reputation for reliable, high-quality work on smaller projects, and demand for his services was increasing. The stress and uncertainty that had characterized his work life for several years began to ease, and his health continued to improve. Margaret seemed happier and more relaxed as well. With Chloe settled at college and my father's business stabilizing, she had more time to focus on her own interests and activities. She became involved with several charitable organizations and took on volunteer leadership roles that utilized her organizational skills and social connections. The family dynamic felt more peaceful and balanced than it had in years. Holiday gatherings were pleasant, with less underlying tension and more genuine enjoyment of each other's company. Chloe would return from college with stories of her classes and new experiences, and I would share updates about my engineering courses and future career plans. During one Christmas dinner, my father raised his glass in a toast to both of his daughters, expressing pride in Chloe's academic success and my determination in pursuing my engineering degree. He said that watching both of us work toward our goals reminded him of why family was the most important thing in life, and he felt fortunate to have children who were building meaningful futures for themselves. The toast felt like a moment of genuine family unity, with past disappointments and resentments set aside in favor of celebrating current achievements and future possibilities. For the first time in years, I felt truly included and valued as a full member of the family rather than an afterthought or burden. My senior year of college was demanding but rewarding. I was taking advanced engineering courses, working on a capstone design project, and beginning to research career opportunities for after graduation. David had offered me a permanent position at his firm with increased responsibilities and a significant salary increase, but I was also considering other options that might offer different types of experience or growth opportunities. The prospect of graduating with an engineering degree and beginning my professional career felt surreal after the years of uncertainty and delayed plans. I had proven to myself that persistence and hard work could overcome obstacles and setbacks, and I was confident about my ability to succeed in whatever career path I chose. During the spring of my senior year, my father began experiencing some concerning symptoms that prompted another round of medical evaluations. The cardiologist was worried about changes in his heart function and recommended additional testing to determine whether his condition was deteriorating. The tests revealed that his heart disease was progressing more rapidly than expected, and more aggressive treatment options needed to be considered. The medical team explained that my father's prognosis was uncertain, but that he would likely need significant lifestyle modifications and possibly surgical interventions to maintain his health. The stress of this diagnosis was difficult for the entire family, but particularly challenging for Margaret, who had been his primary caregiver and support system throughout his previous health issues. During this period of uncertainty about my father's health, I graduated from college with highest honors and a degree in civil engineering. The accomplishment felt bittersweet given the medical concerns, but my father insisted on attending the graduation ceremony despite feeling weak and tired. Seeing him in the audience, beaming with pride as I walked across the stage, was one of the most meaningful moments of my life. After graduation, I accepted David's offer to join his firm as a full-time engineer, with the understanding that I would begin studying for the professional engineering licensure exam. The salary was sufficient to allow me to pay off my student loans relatively quickly while maintaining a comfortable lifestyle. I moved to a larger apartment and began to furnish it with higher quality pieces that reflected my improved financial situation. My father's health continued to decline gradually over the following months. He required more frequent medical appointments and had less energy for work-related activities. Margaret took on increasing responsibility for managing his business operations, working closely with his longtime employees and contractors to ensure that ongoing projects were completed successfully. The role reversal was difficult for my father, who had always been the primary decision-maker and driving force behind his business. However, Margaret proved to be highly capable in managing both the administrative and client-facing aspects of the work. Her organizational skills and attention to detail were well suited to the coordination required for construction projects. As my father's condition worsened, discussions about the future of his business became more frequent and urgent. He was reluctant to retire completely, but it was becoming clear that he couldn't maintain the pace and stress of active project management. Margaret suggested that they might consider selling the business to a larger firm that could provide continuity for employees and clients while ensuring that my father received fair compensation for the company he had built. These conversations were emotionally difficult for my father, who had spent decades building his reputation and client relationships. The business represented not just his livelihood, but his professional identity and legacy. The prospect of selling felt like admitting defeat, even though it was clearly the most practical option given his health limitations. I tried to be supportive during this transition period, offering to help with any aspects of the business evaluation or sale process that might benefit from my engineering background. My father appreciated the offer, but seemed reluctant to involve me too deeply in decisions that would primarily affect Margaret's financial security. He wanted to ensure that whatever arrangements were made would provide adequately for her future needs without creating complications or conflicts within the family. The business was eventually sold to a regional construction company that retained most of my father's employees and maintained relationships with his established clients. The sale price was fair, though not as high as it might have been if my father had been in better health and able to negotiate from a position of strength. Still, the proceeds provided enough financial security to cover his medical expenses and ensure that Margaret would be comfortable regardless of how his health progressed. With the stress of business ownership removed, my father's health seemed to stabilize somewhat. He had more time to rest and follow his medical treatment regimen, and he appeared more relaxed and content than he had been in months. He took pride in following my engineering career and would often ask detailed questions about projects I was working on and challenges I was facing in my professional development. Our relationship during this period was closer and more authentic. than it had been since my childhood. Without the pressures of business management and financial stress, he had more emotional energy to invest in family relationships. We would have long conversations about engineering principles, construction techniques, and industry trends that reminded me of the discussions we had shared when I was young and fascinated by his work. Margaret also seemed more relaxed and fulfilled during this time. With the business sold and my father's health relatively stable, she had more flexibility to pursue her own interests while still providing the care and support he needed. She became more involved in community activities and seemed to enjoy having a clearer sense of their financial security and future plans. During the fall of my second year as a professional engineer, my father's health took a dramatic turn for the worse. He was hospitalized after experiencing severe chest pain and difficulty breathing, and tests revealed that his heart function had deteriorated significantly. The cardiologist explained that treatment options were limited and that the focus would need to shift from aggressive intervention to comfort care and quality of life management. The transition to hospice care was emotionally devastating for all of us. My father had always been such a vibrant, energetic person that seeing him weakened and dependent felt almost impossible to accept. Margaret was determined to care for him at home, with support from hospice nurses and medical equipment that would keep him comfortable during his final weeks or months. I took a leave of absence from work to spend more time with my father and help Margaret manage his care. The experience of watching someone you love gradually decline is unlike anything else, requiring a combination of practical caregiving skills and emotional resilience that tests every aspect of your character and relationships. During quiet moments, when my father was resting comfortably, he would talk about his life, his regrets, and his hopes for our family's future. He expressed gratitude for the relationships he had built and the work he had accomplished, while also acknowledging mistakes he had made and opportunities he wished he had handled differently. One afternoon, as we sat together in his study surrounded by the business awards and family photos that represented his life's achievements, he brought up the topic of his will and estate planning. He explained that he had updated his legal documents several times over the years as his family and financial circumstances changed, and he wanted to make sure I understood his current wishes and the reasoning behind his decisions. He told me that the majority of his assets would go to Margaret, since she would need financial security and had sacrificed her own career to support him and manage their household. There were also specific provisions for Chloe's continued education and future needs, reflecting his commitment to her as his stepdaughter and the daughter Margaret had raised. For me, he had designated his collection of engineering books and professional equipment, along with some family heirlooms that had belonged to my mother. There was also a modest financial inheritance that would help with any remaining student loans or provide seed money for future investments. He emphasized that while the monetary amount was smaller than what Margaret and Chloe would receive, it reflected his confidence in my ability to build a successful career and create financial security for myself. The conversation was difficult, but important. I appreciated his honesty about the estate planning decisions and his acknowledgement that the distributions weren't equal in dollar amounts. His reasoning made sense given the different circumstances and needs of each family member, and I was touched that he had thought carefully about what would be most meaningful and useful for me personally. More than the specific bequests, I valued his expression of pride in what I had accomplished and his confidence in my future success. Knowing that he saw me as capable and independent was worth more than any inheritance could have been. Our relationship had been complicated over the years, but in his final weeks, I felt truly seen and appreciated by him as an adult and as his daughter. My father passed away peacefully on a Tuesday morning in late November, with Margaret and me holding his hands as he took his final breaths. The hospice nurse confirmed that he was no longer in pain and that his passing had been as gentle as anyone could hope for under the circumstances. Despite expecting this outcome for weeks, the reality of his death was still shocking and heartbreaking. The funeral arrangements were handled primarily by Margaret, who had discussed his preferences with him extensively during his final weeks. He had wanted a simple service that celebrated his life and work, rather than dwelling on the sadness of his death. The funeral home chapel was filled with family members, business associates, and community friends who had known him throughout his career and personal life. The service included readings from colleagues who spoke about his integrity and craftsmanship, as well as personal tributes from family members. Margaret gave a beautiful eulogy about their marriage and partnership, emphasizing his generosity and dedication to family. Chloe, who had flown home from college, shared memories of his support for her education and interests. When my turn came to speak, I talked about the lessons he had taught me about persistence and problem-solving, both through his example as an engineer and through the challenges we had navigated together as a family. I mentioned how his encouragement of my curiosity and interest in building things had shaped my career path, even when that path took unexpected turns. The burial was held at the cemetery where my mother was interred, and my father was laid to rest beside her in a plot he had purchased years earlier. Standing at the graveside, I felt a sense of completion and peace, knowing that whatever complicated emotions I had carried about our relationship, we had found our way to genuine understanding and love before his death. After the funeral, family and friends gathered at the house for a reception that Margaret had organized with help from several close friends. The atmosphere was sad, but also warm, with people sharing stories about my father's kindness, humor, and professional accomplishments. I felt supported by the community of people who had cared about him and who extended that care to his family during our time of grief. As the reception wound down and extended family members began to leave, Margaret asked if I could stay behind to discuss some practical matters related to settling my father's estate. She explained that there would be several legal and financial tasks to complete over the coming weeks, and she wanted to make sure we were coordinated in handling all the necessary paperwork and decisions. We sat in the living room as the catering staff cleaned up, and Margaret pulled out a folder containing copies of legal documents and financial statements. She explained that my father's attorney would be scheduling a formal reading of the will within the next few days, but she wanted to give me a preview of the major provisions so there wouldn't be any surprises or confusion during the official process. As she outlined the estate distribution, I noticed that her description differed somewhat from what my father had told me during our conversation in his study. According to Margaret's summary, the bulk of his assets would indeed go to her, and there were substantial provisions for Chloe's education and future needs. However, my inheritance seemed even more modest than what my father had described, consisting primarily of personal items and a small cash amount that would barely cover my remaining student loan balance. When I mentioned that my father had given me a different impression of the inheritance amounts, Margaret looked confused and suggested that perhaps his medications had affected his memory or judgment during our conversation. She assured me that the will reflected his most recent and carefully considered wishes, prepared with legal counsel and proper documentation. I felt a flicker of unease about the discrepancy, but I also recognized that my father had been quite ill during our final conversations and might indeed have been confused about financial details. Estate planning documents are complex, and it was possible that his explanation to me had been simplified or inaccurate. Margaret certainly had no reason to misrepresent the contents of legal documents that would be officially reviewed within days. The formal reading of the will took place the following week in the office of my father's attorney, James Morrison. Margaret, Chloe, and I were present, along with Mr. Morrison and his assistant. The atmosphere was formal and somewhat somber as Mr. Morrison explained the legal process and began to read through the document's major provisions. As he detailed the asset distributions, I realized that Margaret's preview had been accurate. The will left the house, business proceeds, and majority of financial assets to her, with significant educational and future provisions for Chloe. My inheritance consisted of my father's engineering books, some family photographs, and a cash amount of $15,000. While I listened to these details, I found myself thinking about the conversation I had shared with my father in his study. His description of my inheritance had suggested a more substantial amount, enough to pay off student loans and provide seed money for investments. $15,000 was generous but fell short of what he had indicated I would receive. However, I also reminded myself that my father's primary concern had been ensuring that Margaret and Chloe would be financially secure, and the will certainly achieved that goal. My own financial situation was stable, and I didn't need a large inheritance to maintain my lifestyle or career prospects. The sentimental items he had left me were meaningful and appropriate, representing our shared interest in engineering and preserving family memories. After the reading, Mr. Morrison explained the timeline for settling the estate and distributing assets. Most of the process would be handled over the following months, with final distributions expected to be completed within 6 to 8 months. He provided contact information for questions or concerns and assured us that his office would handle all legal requirements and paperwork. As we left the attorney's office, Margaret seemed relieved that the formal reading was complete and that there had been no disputes or complications regarding the will's provisions. She mentioned that she was grateful my father had been so thorough in his estate planning, making the process as straightforward as possible during an already difficult time. Chloe would be returning to college soon, and Margaret was planning to spend some time deciding what changes she wanted to make to the house and her daily routines. She invited me to take any of my father's personal belongings that held special meaning for me, beyond the items specifically mentioned in the will. Over the following weeks, I visited the house several times to sort through my father's possessions and select items I wanted to keep. His engineering books and professional equipment would be useful in my own career, and I appreciated having physical reminders of his expertise and accomplishments. I also chose a few pieces of furniture and artwork that held special memories from my childhood. During one of these visits, I was looking through papers in my father's study when I discovered something that stopped me cold. Tucked behind other documents in his desk drawer was a handwritten note dated just 2 weeks before his death. The note appeared to be instructions for his attorney regarding a final update to his will, specifying that my inheritance should be increased to $50,000 and that certain business assets should be held in trust for my future use. The handwriting was clearly my father's, and the date indicated that he had written these instructions during the period when we had been having our conversations about the estate. The note suggested that our discussion had indeed prompted him to consider adjusting the will to better reflect his wishes for my inheritance. I stared at the document, trying to understand what had happened. Had my father intended to make these changes but died before they could be implemented? Had he given these instructions to his attorney but somehow the updates weren't completed? Or had the note simply been a draft of ideas that he had decided not to pursue? The discovery created a dilemma that I hadn't anticipated. If my father had truly intended to modify the will as indicated in the note, then the current document might not reflect his final wishes. However, handwritten notes aren't legally binding, and challenging a will based on undocumented intentions would be complicated and potentially damaging to family relationships. I spent several sleepless nights considering how to handle this information. Part of me wanted to show the note to Mr. Morrison and ask whether it had any legal significance or whether my father had discussed these changes with him. Another part of me worried that raising questions about the will would appear greedy or disrespectful to my father's memory. Ultimately, I decided to schedule a private meeting with Mr. Morrison to discuss the note and determine whether it had any bearing on the estate settlement. I brought the document to his office and explained where I had found it and what it seemed to indicate about my father's intentions. Mr. Morrison examined the note carefully and checked his files for any record of communications from my father regarding will modifications. He confirmed that my father had not contacted his office about making changes to the will after the most recent update, which had been completed several months before his death. He explained that handwritten notes like this weren't uncommon among clients who were considering estate planning changes, but hadn't yet decided to move forward with formal modifications. The note indicated my father's thinking at a particular moment, but didn't constitute legal instructions or create any obligations for the estate. However, Mr. Morrison also mentioned that if I had concerns about whether the will accurately reflected my father's final wishes, there were legal procedures for challenging estate documents. Such challenges were complex and expensive, requiring evidence that the will was invalid due to undue influence, lack of mental capacity, or failure to follow proper legal procedures. After our meeting, I felt more confused than before. The note clearly indicated that my father had been considering changes that would have benefited me financially, but there was no way to know whether he had decided against making those changes or had simply run out of time to implement them. Challenging the will would require significant legal expenses and would almost certainly damage my relationships with Margaret and Chloe, regardless of the outcome. I also had to consider whether pursuing this matter aligned with my own values and goals. My father had raised me to be independent and self-reliant, and I had successfully built a career and financial stability without depending on family wealth. Did I really want to risk family relationships for the possibility of a larger inheritance that I didn't actually need for my security or happiness? After weeks of consideration, I decided not to pursue any legal challenge to the will. The note was interesting and perhaps indicated my father's evolving thoughts about the estate, but it wasn't sufficient evidence to justify the disruption and expense of a legal dispute. I would accept the inheritance as specified in the official will and focus on preserving the positive memories and relationships that mattered most to me. This decision brought a sense of peace and closure that allowed me to move forward with grieving my father's death and adjusting to life without his presence. The question of whether I had received exactly what he intended for me would remain unanswered, but that uncertainty was less important than maintaining family harmony and honoring the values he had taught me about integrity and independence. 6 months after my father's death, the estate settlement was completed, and final distributions were made according to the terms of his will. I received the $15,000, his engineering books, and the personal items that had been designated for me. Margaret inherited the house and financial assets that would provide security for her future, and Chloe's educational trust was established to support her continued studies and early career development. The process had been handled efficiently and professionally, with no legal complications or family disputes. From an outside perspective, my father's estate planning had been successful in providing for his family's needs and wishes. The unresolved questions I carried about his final intentions were internal concerns that didn't affect the practical outcomes or relationships involved. As I settled into my new reality as someone who had lost a parent and inherited both financial, resources, and family responsibilities, I felt a mixture of sadness, gratitude, and determination. My father's death marked the end of one chapter of my life, but it also represented the beginning of new opportunities to build on the foundation he had helped me create. The engineering career I had worked so hard to establish was flourishing, and I was beginning to consider whether I wanted to pursue additional education or professional certifications that would open new doors for advancement. The modest inheritance I had received would provide helpful financial cushion for taking calculated risks or investing in opportunities that might not have been feasible otherwise. More importantly, I felt confident in my ability to navigate life's challenges with the resilience and problem-solving skills that my father had modeled throughout his career and personal struggles. His legacy wasn't primarily financial, but rather the example he had set of persistence, integrity, and commitment to building something meaningful with your life and work. As winter turned to spring and I began to emerge from the acute grief of losing my father, I started to envision what the next phase of my life might look like. I had proven to myself that I could overcome obstacles and achieve goals even when the path was longer and more difficult than originally planned. I had built strong professional relationships and developed expertise that was valued by clients and colleagues. The future felt full of possibilities, and I was eager to discover what new challenges and opportunities awaited me. My father's death had been painful, but it had also clarified my priorities and strengthened my appreciation for the relationships and experiences that give life meaning. I was ready to honor his memory by continuing to build on the foundation we had created together, while also forging my own path forward with confidence and purpose. 2 years after my father's death, I had established myself as a respected engineer in the regional construction industry. My work on several high-profile projects had earned recognition from professional organizations, and I was being recruited by larger firms offering significant career advancement opportunities. Life felt stable and purposeful, built on the foundation of independence and resilience that my father had helped me develop. It was during this period of professional success that I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The caller identified himself as Detective Raymond Torres from the Financial Crimes Unit of the State Police. He explained that they were investigating irregularities in estate planning documents and wanted to discuss my father's will as part of a broader case involving fraudulent legal documents. My initial reaction was confusion and concern. I explained that my father's estate had been settled 2 years earlier without any legal challenges or complications. Detective Torres acknowledged this but said that new information had come to light during their investigation of other cases that suggested my father's will might have been altered after his death. The detective asked if I could meet with him to discuss what I knew about my father's estate planning process and whether I had noticed anything unusual about the final documents. He emphasized that I wasn't a suspect in any wrongdoing, but might have information that could help their investigation into what appeared to be a pattern of document fraud involving several clients of the same law firm. I agreed to meet with Detective Torres the following week, though I felt bewildered about what information I could possibly provide that would be relevant to a criminal investigation. The handwritten note I had discovered in my father's desk seemed like it might be pertinent, so I located it among my papers and brought it with me to the meeting. Detective Torres was a soft-spoken man in his 40s with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He explained that their investigation had begun when a family in another county discovered that their father's will had been modified without authorization, with changes made to benefit individuals who had not been included in the original document. The alterations were sophisticated enough that they weren't immediately obvious, but became apparent when compared to earlier drafts and legal files. When I showed him the handwritten note from my father's desk, Detective Torres examined it carefully and asked detailed questions about when I had found it and what I knew about my father's conversations with his attorney. He explained that the note was significant because it suggested that my father had intended to make changes to his will that weren't reflected in the final document. Over the course of our 2-hour meeting, Detective Torres revealed information that fundamentally changed my understanding of what had happened with my father's estate. Their investigation had uncovered evidence that James Morrison, my father's attorney, had been systematically altering clients' wills after their deaths to benefit individuals who had paid him substantial bribes for these modifications. The scheme involved Morrison working with accomplices who would identify wealthy clients with complex family situations and health problems. The accomplices would cultivate relationships with these clients' spouses or other family members, gathering information about family dynamics and financial assets. After the client's death, Morrison would create falsified versions of their wills that redistributed assets according to arrangements he had made with the accomplices. Detective Torres explained that Margaret had been under surveillance for several months as part of their investigation. Bank records showed that she had made large cash payments to Morrison both before and after my father's death, payments that couldn't be explained by legitimate legal fees or services. Phone records indicated numerous calls between Margaret and Morrison during the period when my father was dying, calls that occurred at odd hours and suggested coordination beyond normal attorney-client communications. The realization that Margaret had been involved in manipulating my father's will was devastating and infuriating. It meant that the document we had all accepted as reflecting his final wishes was actually a fabrication designed to maximize her inheritance at the expense of his true intentions. The handwritten note I had found was likely evidence of what my father had actually wanted, instructions that Morrison had ignored in favor of the fraudulent version he had created with Margaret's assistance. Detective Torres asked if I would be willing to cooperate with their investigation by providing testimony about the discrepancies I had noticed and helping them build a case against Morrison and his accomplices. He explained that successful prosecution would likely result in criminal charges and might also provide grounds for challenging the fraudulent will in civil court. I agreed immediately to provide whatever assistance I could. The thought that Margaret had manipulated my grieving father and stolen money that was rightfully mine was enraging. But even more disturbing was the realization that she had violated his trust and memory in such a fundamental way. My father had been an honest man who valued integrity above everything else, and the idea that his final wishes had been corrupted for someone else's financial gain was intolerable. Over the following months, I worked closely with Detective Torres and the prosecutorial team to build their case against Morrison and Margaret. The investigation revealed the full scope of their scheme, which had affected dozens of families over a period of several years. Morrison had stolen millions of dollars through fraudulent will modifications, while his accomplices had received substantial kickbacks for their roles in identifying targets and providing inside information about family dynamics. Margaret's involvement was extensive and calculating. Phone records and financial documents showed that she had been planning to manipulate my father's will from almost the moment she learned about his serious heart condition. She had cultivated a relationship with Morrison specifically to facilitate the fraud, and she had carefully orchestrated situations to gather information about my father's assets and estate planning intentions. Her interference with my college plans and my relationship with my father hadn't been typical stepfamily jealousy, but deliberate manipulation intended to reduce my ability to contest his estate or notice irregularities in his will. Understanding this context helped me process some of the anger and resentment I had carried about the limitations and disappointments of my young adult years. While I still regretted the opportunities I had missed and the extra difficulty I had faced in achieving my goals, I now understood that these obstacles had been artificially created by someone who was systematically victimizing my family. The experience also reinforced my appreciation for the independence and resilience I had developed in response to those challenges. If I had followed the traditional path of having my college education fully funded and moving directly from family support to professional success, I might never have developed the self-reliance and problem-solving skills that had served me so well during the investigation and legal proceedings. With the legal cases resolved and my father's estate properly settled, I was finally able to move forward with my life and career plans without the uncertainty and resentment that had shadowed my relationships and decisions for years. The recovered inheritance provided financial flexibility that allowed me to consider opportunities that might not have been feasible otherwise. I decided to use part of the money to pursue a master's degree in engineering management, a combination of technical expertise and business skills that would prepare me for leadership roles in larger organizations. The program was intensive and expensive, but it represented exactly the kind of investment in my future that my father had wanted to make possible through his estate planning. The rest of the recovered money went into savings and investments that would provide long-term security and options for future entrepreneurial ventures. Having learned hard lessons about financial vulnerability and the importance of multiple income streams, I was determined to build wealth that would protect me from depending on others for my security or opportunities. My engineering career continued to flourish as well. The experience of navigating the fraud investigation had demonstrated leadership and analytical skills that impressed my supervisors and colleagues. I was promoted to project manager and began overseeing complex construction projects that utilized all of the technical knowledge and practical experience I had accumulated over the years. The combination of professional success, recovered inheritance, and hard-won personal growth created a sense of stability and optimism about the future that I hadn't felt since childhood. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had the resources and relationships I needed to pursue ambitious goals without constantly worrying about financial security or family dynamics. As I approached my 30th birthday, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had led me from a disappointed high school graduate to a successful engineer who had overcome fraud and family betrayal to build an independent life. The path had been longer and more difficult than anything I could have imagined, but it had also taught me valuable lessons about resilience, integrity, and the importance of fighting for justice even when the odds seem overwhelming. The relationship with Chloe had become one of the most positive aspects of my life during this period. Free from Margaret's manipulation and false family dynamics, we were able to develop a genuine sisterly bond based on mutual respect and understanding. She often sought my advice about career decisions and financial planning, and I appreciated having someone who understood the complexity of our shared family history. We established new traditions for holidays and family celebrations that honored my father's memory while acknowledging the painful realities of what our family had experienced. These gatherings were smaller and quieter than the elaborate events Margaret had organized, but they felt more authentic and meaningful to both of us. The legal victory against Margaret and Morrison also had broader implications beyond my personal situation. The prosecution had uncovered evidence of fraud affecting dozens of other families, many of whom were able to recover stolen assets and find some measure of justice for their losses. The case led to reforms in estate planning oversight and professional conduct standards that would make similar schemes more difficult to execute in the future. Detective Torres later told me that my willingness to pursue the investigation, despite initial skepticism from some officials, had been crucial to uncovering the full scope of the criminal enterprise. If I had accepted the official version of my father's will without question, Margaret and Morrison might have continued victimizing other families for years before being caught. This knowledge reinforced my belief that speaking up about suspected wrongdoing is not only personally important, but can also protect others from harm. The decision to challenge what seemed like a legitimate legal document had felt risky and potentially destructive at the time, but it had ultimately served justice and prevented additional crimes. Looking forward, I felt optimistic about the opportunities and relationships that lay ahead. The master's degree program would prepare me for leadership roles in engineering and construction management, fields where women were still underrepresented, but where my combination of technical skills and practical experience would be highly valued. I was also beginning to consider the possibility of starting my own engineering consulting firm someday, using the recovered inheritance as seed capital for a business that could provide specialized services to clients who needed innovative solutions for complex construction challenges. The entrepreneurial path would be risky, but my experience with overcoming obstacles and fighting for my goals had given me confidence in my ability to navigate uncertainty and build something meaningful. The personal relationships in my life had also stabilized and deepened in ways that provided emotional support for pursuing ambitious professional goals. My friendship with Chloe had evolved into a genuine sisterhood that neither of us had experienced during our childhood. I had also developed close professional relationships and mentorship connections that created a network of support for my continued career development. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment and advocate for myself effectively, skills that would serve me well, regardless of what challenges or opportunities the future might bring. The experience of uncovering and prosecuting the estate fraud had proven that persistence and integrity could overcome even sophisticated attempts at manipulation and theft. As I prepared to begin my master's degree program and continue building my engineering career, I felt grateful for the unexpected journey that had led me to this point. The setbacks and betrayals that had seemed so devastating at the time had ultimately contributed to developing the character and capabilities that made my current success possible. My father's true legacy wasn't the money that Margaret had tried to steal, but the values and determination he had instilled in me through his example of hard work and integrity. The handwritten note that had provided evidence for the legal case was really just confirmation of what I had known all along, that he had loved me and believed in my potential to build a meaningful life through my own efforts and choices. The story that had begun with disappointment and family betrayal had evolved into one of justice, recovery, and personal growth. While I wouldn't have chosen to experience the fraud and legal battles, the process had ultimately strengthened my relationships, clarified my values, and provided resources that would enable me to pursue goals that might not have been possible otherwise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Her interference with my college plans and my relationship with my father hadn't been typical stepfamily jealousy, but deliberate manipulation intended to reduce my ability to contest his estate or notice irregularities in his will. Understanding. This context helped me process some of the anger and resentment I had carried about the limitations and disappointments of my young adult years. While I still regretted the opportunities I had missed and the extra difficulty I had faced in achieving my goals, I now understood that these obstacles had been artificially created by someone who was systematically victimizing my family. The experience also reinforced my appreciation for the independence and resilience I had developed in response to those challenges. If I had followed the traditional path of having my college education fully funded and moving directly from family support to professional success, I might never have developed the self-reliance and problem-solving skills that had served me so well during the investigation and legal proceedings. With the legal cases resolved and my father's estate properly settled, I was finally able to move forward with my life and career plans without the uncertainty and resentment that had shadowed my relationships and decisions for years. The recovered inheritance provided financial flexibility that allowed me to consider opportunities that might not have been feasible otherwise. I decided to use part of the money to pursue a master's degree in engineering management, a combination of technical expertise and business skills that would prepare me for leadership roles in larger organizations. The program was intensive and expensive, but it represented exactly the kind of investment in my future that my father had wanted to make possible through his estate planning. The rest of the recovered money went into savings and investments that would provide long-term security and options for future entrepreneurial ventures. Having learned hard lessons about financial vulnerability and the importance of multiple income streams, I was determined to build wealth that would protect me from depending on others for my security or opportunities. My engineering career continued to flourish as well. The experience of navigating the fraud investigation had demonstrated leadership and analytical skills that impressed my supervisors and colleagues. I was promoted to project manager and began overseeing complex construction projects that utilized all of the technical knowledge and practical experience I had accumulated over the years. The combination of professional success, recovered inheritance, and hard-won personal growth created a sense of stability and optimism about the future that I hadn't felt since childhood. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had the resources and relationships I needed to pursue ambitious goals without constantly worrying about financial security or family dynamics. As I approached my 30th birthday, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had led me from a disappointed high school graduate to a successful engineer who had overcome fraud and family betrayal to build an independent life. The path had been longer and more difficult than anything I could have imagined, but it had also taught me valuable lessons about resilience, integrity, and the importance of fighting for justice, even when the odds seem overwhelming. The relationship with Chloe had become one of the most positive aspects of my life during this period. Free from Margaret's manipulation and false family dynamics, we were able to develop a genuine sisterly bond based on mutual respect and understanding. She often sought my advice about career decisions and financial planning, and I appreciated having someone who understood the complexity of our shared family history. We established new traditions for holidays and family celebrations that honored my father's memory while acknowledging the painful realities of what our family had experienced. These gatherings were smaller and quieter than the elaborate events Margaret had organized, but they felt more authentic and meaningful to both of us. The legal victory against Margaret and Morrison also had broader implications beyond my personal situation. The prosecution had uncovered evidence of fraud affecting dozens of other families, many of whom were able to recover stolen assets and find some measure of justice for their losses. The case led to reforms in estate planning oversight, and professional conduct standards that would make similar schemes more difficult to execute in the future. Detective Torres later told me that my willingness to pursue the investigation, despite initial skepticism from some officials, had been crucial to uncovering the full scope of the criminal enterprise. If I had accepted the official version of my father's will without question, Margaret and Morrison might have continued victimizing other families for years before being caught. This knowledge reinforced my belief that speaking up about suspected wrongdoing is not only personally important, but can also protect others from harm. The decision to challenge what seemed like a legitimate legal document had felt risky and potentially destructive at the time, but it had ultimately served justice and prevented additional crimes. Looking forward, I felt optimistic about the opportunities and relationships that lay ahead. The master's degree program would prepare me for leadership roles in engineering and construction management, fields where women were still underrepresented, but where my combination of technical skills and practical experience would be highly valued. I was also beginning to consider the possibility of starting my own engineering consulting firm someday, using the recovered inheritance as seed capital for a business that could provide specialized services to clients who needed innovative solutions for complex construction challenges. The entrepreneurial path would be risky, but my experience with overcoming obstacles and fighting for my goals had given me confidence in my ability to navigate uncertainty and build something meaningful. The personal relationships in my life had also stabilized and deepened in ways that provided emotional support for pursuing ambitious professional goals. My friendship with Chloe had evolved into a genuine sisterhood that neither of us had experienced during our childhood. I had also developed close professional relationships and mentorship connections that created a network of support for my continued career development. Most importantly, I had learned to trust my own judgment and advocate for myself effectively, skills that would serve me well regardless of what challenges or opportunities the future might bring. The experience of uncovering and prosecuting the estate fraud had proven that persistence and integrity could overcome even sophisticated attempts at manipulation and theft. As I prepared to begin my master's degree program and continue building my engineering career, I felt grateful for the unexpected journey that had led me to this point. The setbacks and betrayals that had seemed so devastating at the time had ultimately contributed to developing the character and capabilities that made my current success possible. My father's true legacy wasn't the money that Margaret had tried to steal, but the values and determination he had instilled in me through his example of hard work and integrity. The handwritten note that had provided evidence for the legal case was really just confirmation of what I had known all along, that he had loved me and believed in my potential to build a meaningful life through my own efforts and choices. The story that had begun with disappointment and family betrayal had evolved into one of justice, recovery, and personal growth. While I wouldn't have chosen to experience the fraud and legal battles, the process had ultimately strengthened my relationships, clarified my values, and provided resources that would enable me to pursue goals that might not have been possible otherwise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.